Hey, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for letting me get back to my office from where I was for the program. And thank you for joining us for this conversation on racial justice. I hope that you enjoyed the lunch program. Thank you again for being with us. And thank you then for joining us for this conversation, which we're really looking forward to. So a couple of things, a little housekeeping matters before we begin. Number one, there is closed captioning available for this program as well. You can just press the CC button on your screen and the captions will appear. Second, we want your questions. You can put them in the chat or you can email them to lunch. That's one word, lunch, like the thing we wish we were all eating. lunch@aclu-il.org. And so you've heard enough from me. Let's skip over. And I want to welcome my partner for the next half hour, the legal director of the ACLU of Illinois, Nusrat Choudhury, who has been with us for about a year. And Nusrat, thank you for joining us for this program today.
Well, Ed, I'll talk to you anytime, whether it's for the lunch or just every day at work.
So I'll ask you, Nusrat, just as we still have a couple people joining us, how'd you enjoy the program?
I thought it was amazingly inspiring. I mean, who better to have in a year where racial justice has been our focus than Stacey Abrams? She's a fearless leader and she's a model for us all.
All right, let's jump in, okay? So we heard Colleen talk about the need to confront racial justice in all of our work. And I wonder if you could just talk for a moment, you know, from your perspective as the legal director of the ACLU of Illinois, how that informs your work. How does it affect the cases that are selected? How do you think about this? How do you conceptualize it?
Well, I think I have to start from a really personal level. I think as a Muslim young girl of color here in the Chicago area, race was a part of my reality. It led to police stops that shouldn't have ever happened. It led to family members facing problems at airports, and it led to what I saw around me, which was dramatic residential segregation and different opportunities for people of color than for white people in the city of Chicago. And that led me to join the ACLU and spend more than 11 years bringing litigation and advocacy with partners in communities across the country to advance racial justice. What that looked like was bringing lawsuits against airlines that were racially profiling people who looked Arab, bringing litigation against the New York Police Department for surveilling Muslims, and then bringing lawsuits against racial profiling and stop and frisk that impacted Black people and Latinx people in cities across the country. And Ed, all of those things impact people in Chicago and Illinois. So when we're looking at the cases that we want to bring, the places where we need to double down and really prioritize combating racial injustice, institutional and structural racism in the criminal legal system, in prisons and jails, in the foster system, these are some of our highest priorities. And for the last year, what that has meant is actually bringing litigation against jails that have placed people of color in dangerous conditions where they risk death from COVID-19. Just last month, we brought a lawsuit of that kind against a federal jail in downtown Chicago. And similarly, we continue to challenge police violence, which we know is part of an epidemic hurting people of color across the country.
I really should jump in here and because that was one of the issues I think Colleen mentioned and we wanted to get to is policing. And I wonder how you think about and could talk about how racism sort of infects or implicates the police system, you know, both here in Chicago, where we both are today, but really all across the state of Illinois.
So it looks like there's construction right across my street. I hope that's not, but we will persevere. I mean, policing and race are entwined. Most of us should know that the modern police department was founded based on slave patrols. And that was the foundation of the first municipal police department in Charleston, South Carolina. And we've seen that connection between racialized police violence in cities across the country, even through Jim Crow, through segregation in the North, and we need look no further than the city of Chicago. For decades, the former police commander of the Chicago Police Department, John Burge, tortured Black and Latinx people, shocking their bodies with electric devices, burning them with cigarettes, engaging in sexual assault, engaging other officers in these acts of torture to extort false confessions. And even more recently, we see communities on the south and west sides of Chicago blanketed with police stops for low-level things like loitering and disorderly conduct, which don't even mean anything, but what they result in are police acting like occupying forces in communities of color in a way that they do not in communities that are predominantly white, and that leads to alienation, and each one of those interactions can lead to escalation, force, and death.
So let me sort of go on and talk about another issue that's kind of close to policing or interrelated. But one of the things that happens, of course, is, and we're seeing this now in the COVID era, budgets get tight for governments. So what do? The next thing you read is, oh, well, they're going to increase this fine, or they're going to increase a fee of some sort. Does that have racial justice implications?
It's completely linked to ticketing and policing. So what we're seeing is this circle where a lot of tickets are issued, not because people are doing something that hurts public safety, but because the tickets generate revenue and the revenue fills those budget gaps. But the result is this over-policing of communities of color. So looking again to Chicago, take the example of a woman, Sandra Botello, a Latina woman who lived in Chicago a couple of years ago. She had to face a choice. Does she pay $400 for her child to get registered in a private school where her son had full tuition but still needed to pay that registration fee? Or does she pay the fee to get a vehicle sticker, which you're required to have in the city of Chicago and is quite a hefty fee? She chose the school registration fee. Within a month and a half, she had $1,000 worth of tickets put on her car.
I want to stop and underscore this. This isn't $1,000 over the course of a year. It's in how long?
45 days.
Yeah.
For the same issue, which was that she couldn't afford a city sticker. That $1,000 with additional fees then became $3,000. And what did the city do when she couldn't pay? They took her car and then added even more fees to the point where she couldn't get a job because she didn't have the car she needed to get to work. And the city then charged even more money. She eventually lost her car. This is the kind of stuff that is happening to people of color in Illinois, in Chicago, predominantly Black and Latinx people because of the racial wealth gap, which is a longstanding problem in Chicago. And Ed, I think I want to go back a little bit to the policing issue, because when you think about the solutions to these problems, we also need to talk about partnering with the communities that are most impacted. So whether it's fines and fees, or whether it's racialized policing that's leading to violence against people of color, it's really working with community groups where the ACLU of Illinois can see our biggest wins. So in Chicago, here, we're challenging police excessive force with a coalition of community organizations, many of whom are hopefully here joining us today for our lunch because they are valued partners in our work. And this coalition together is enforcing a consent decree against the city of Chicago that requires systemic reform of racialized violence, the kind of violence we saw last summer when racial justice protesters in the city of Chicago were met with force, like baton strikes to the head, chemical agents, in contrast to the rioters who tried to storm the Capitol on January 6th, who were predominantly white. I mean, that's the kind of action and advocacy that we seek to do with our partners on the ground. And we do that in the policing space, as well as in tackling fines and fees.
One of our viewers here today had a question about what we're doing to combat racism on sort of the micro, on the neighborhood level. And I want to kind of tie that, if I could, for just a moment to the policing issue. Is that really where you're driving with these community groups, is to try to get a policing system that reflects the community and what the community is looking for?
Yeah, the policing system has to engage with the people who are most impacted. And in Chicago, for example, what that means is listening to people in the south and west sides of Chicago who are predominantly Black and Latinx and have suffered from police violence. These are communities that have high rates of stops and frisks, communities that were out protesting last summer and being beaten up by police, communities that many of you have seen are impacted by these wrong home raids, like the raid on Ms. Anjanette Young, a Black social worker.
The video that we all saw a few weeks ago.
Horrific video where she was standing in her home. She was, decompressing after a long day of work as a social worker, and police barged into her home. It was actually the wrong address. And they stood around her while she was naked, holding her at gunpoint while she pleaded with them, terrified, saying, "You've got the wrong house." That is what happens not just to one person, but to dozens and hundreds of people in the city of Chicago, and not just in Chicago, in cities across Illinois. And this is the kind of racialized policing that community groups are standing up against. Community groups have worked with Ms. Young and alder people in the city of Chicago to draft the Anjanette Young ordinance that would put in place really strong protections against those kinds of wrong raids. And we are supporting that ordinance with the coalition that we work on to enforce the Chicago Police Consent Decree. And it's that sort of engagement that can happen, not just at the micro level, but the city level and the state level and the federal level as well.
And is it fair to say, I'm sorry, I've worked on these issues for a long time. I shouldn't be, but one of the things we see is that actually the racial bias really flows all the way through the system, from the stop and frisk to from the stop and frisk to what you were talking about as who ends up in our prisons.
There is a direct link. I mean, we have a mass incarceration epidemic in the United States and Illinois, and the people who it's predominantly impacting are Black and Latinx. They're funneled into the system through this policing that is often geared towards generating revenue, that treats people of color like cash registers, not as people who deserve protection. And then once in the system, what we see as counsel in a class action trying to protect people in the Illinois prison system are Black and Latinx people not getting the care that they need, the medical care and dental care, and experiencing high risk of harm. And this impacts prisons, it impacts the foster system, it impacts healthcare. Racism is present in all of these systems, and what we need are systemic solutions.
So I want to pick up there because it's a really interesting thing. The ACLU of Illinois has a long history in terms of working on the child welfare system in our state, and I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that work, but then also what are the kind of racial justice implications for that?
Yeah, since 1991, we and our partners have served as class counsel for all abused and neglected children who are in the custody of the Illinois foster system. And for decades, what that has meant is battling a truly broken system that disproportionately impacts Black people in particular. So 43% of the children in the foster system are Black, and only 15% of Illinois' population is Black. And it might be easy to blame Black families for this, but when you look at it, there are really racialized notions of what is proper childcare, of who's caring for their family and abusing them versus who is struggling with poverty. And I think some of those deep-seated issues we need to look at and we need to really dismantle in order to solve some of the racial injustices in this system.
I've got a couple of other issues I want to get to before we're done here. But one of the questions we got from one of our viewers was just if you could talk a little bit more about the consent decree in Chicago with those community group partners and sort of how that's being implemented, what that process looks like. We're not all lawyers and can speak consent decree fluently.
Well, and I think it's important to even start a little further back in 2014 when the world watched in horror the video of Chicago police killing a teenager, Laquan McDonald. And the furor, just rightfully so, over that killing led to the US Department of Justice to investigate the Chicago Police Department. And that investigation, which was concluded at the tail end of the Obama administration, revealed that there's an epidemic of excessive force by Chicago police against people of color and people with disabilities. That led to multiple lawsuits, including one by the ACLU of Illinois and our community partners, as well as another lawsuit by the Attorney General and a third lawsuit by other community groups. And all of those lawsuits were resolved with what's called a consent decree. This is a very long court order requiring the Chicago police to overhaul how it treats people, and particularly with an eye towards fighting biased policing and excessive force. And the coalition of community groups that we work with, which include Communities United, One North Side, Community Renewal Society, Next Steps. It also includes other organizations like Black Lives Matter Chicago, Good Kids Mad City, and others. This coalition has the unique power to enforce the consent decree. When we see violations happening on the streets of Chicago, we can bring it to the federal court. And we did exactly that when we saw racial justice protesters being beaten by Chicago police last summer. And we did that when we saw home raids traumatizing and brutalizing not just Anjanette Young, but hundreds of children, Black children and families in the city of Chicago.
So there are the big issues that you're working on over time, and then as these other issues arise, you're able to go to the court and seek a more immediate redress?
Exactly. And what we try to do is use this consent decree as a way to require the city to engage with the communities who are most impacted. Because too often we see a pattern where police departments don't want to actually talk to the communities who have the lived experience. They're the ones who are feeling these practices. They're the ones who know what is needs to dismantle them and end them, and actually treat them like communities who deserve to be kept safe, like everybody else.
Like everyone else, yeah, which is part of it. We got another question, and I'm sorry I'm bouncing around a little bit here, but just given the limited amount of time we have, thinking about this outside of the city of Chicago, somebody asked, both Colleen and the governor mentioned the recently passed criminal justice and police reform bill, the so-called Safety Act. I wonder if you could talk about, from your perspective, just sort of what you see as being the way in which that will affect, improve, have any impact on policing across the state.
The Safety Act is transformative. And there's a part of the act that you may not have heard of that really seeks to dismantle this horrible cycle between the criminalization, the wrongful criminalization of people of color and people who don't have money, and then fines and fees that try to criminalize people just because they're poor. And this is the part of the Safety Act that ends Illinois' practice of taking away your driver's license when you can't afford to pay traffic tickets, which, as I mentioned, are a tool in this state for closing budget gaps and not necessarily keeping our streets safe. And the Black Caucus, in supporting this bill, and advocates at the transit table who are our partners, they are really helping to lead this fight, including impacted people. What we got in this bill is abolishing this practice. Illinois is now the 13th state in the United States that will no longer automatically suspend your license because you couldn't pay tickets to a court. That is transformative, because 70% of people in the city of Chicago, 86% of people in America rely on a car to get to work. We need our cars to find jobs and earn money and support our families. And it doesn't make sense to take away our licenses when we can't pay money.
Well, we're Americans. We just love our cars usually anyway. I wonder if you could talk about one other thing that's been talked about a little bit in the press about the bill, which is eliminating the requirement for an affidavit, a sworn affidavit, to file a complaint. Why, I think some people sort of wonder, why does that matter? Why is that important?
I was shocked when I learned that in Illinois, a person who wants to report police misconduct needs to sign a sworn affidavit. And what that means is that you might open yourself up to a charge later on that you engaged in perjury simply because you forgot a detail or you made a mistake in the trauma of a police encounter that you then reported to the police as soon as possible. That is an outrageous requirement. We should want people to report what happens to them so that we can then make sure that our police are people who are keeping us safe rather than harming the communities that they're meant to protect. And I think on that note, I want to highlight the story of Jalen Butler, a young person who you all got to hear from today, who is an inspiration. Jalen was a college swimmer coming home from a swim meet when he just got out of a bus to stretch his legs, and all of a sudden was surrounded by police with one officer pinning him to the ground with a knee on his neck and another officer pointing a gun in his forehead. And his story could have ended up like Laquan McDonald. He was lucky in that he survived, but he experienced lasting trauma and has spoken about it and written about it on the ACLU of Illinois blog, that he still suffers trauma to this day from that experience. Requiring someone who's gone through something like that within 24 hours to sign a sworn affidavit is just a barrier to accountability, and it doesn't make us safer. What it does is make us less safe by preventing people from reporting the harm that they experience.
Yeah, it's really an amazing story for that. And it demonstrates that, these kinds of things happen outside of the stories we just see on the national news, and they can be much more commonplace in that way.
Very common, and not just in the big cities. I mean, this happened in Western Illinois. This could happen anywhere. And it could happen when you're least suspecting it, when you're with your swim team friends, your coach, and people who trust and believe in you. And all of a sudden you can be treated differently because of the color of your skin.
I want to try to bring together one other set of issues around this, and that is that the ACLU of Illinois has been somewhat, I would say, somewhat successful over the last 40 years, largely due to our friend Colleen, in terms of working around reproductive rights. But there is a racial justice component to that work as well, isn't there?
There absolutely is. And as you said, because of the work of Colleen and other colleagues in the ACLU, partners across the state, and really courageous representatives in our legislature, in 2019, we enacted a Reproductive Health Act that establishes a fundamental right to reproductive health care. And looking at what's happening around the country, boy, do I feel lucky that I live in Illinois. But what that means in reality is that people who face barriers to healthcare because of their race and because of what's linked to race, which is often poverty and reliance on Medicare and Medicaid, that can really influence whether you can exercise that right. So here in Illinois, we see a lot of mergers and consolidation happening with Catholic hospitals. And with Medicaid managed care plans, a lot of those plans rely on Catholic hospitals that follow rules that limit access to contraception, to abortion care, to sterilization procedures, fertility treatments. And so it means that we've represented women, including Black women, who, when they've gone to get contraceptive care at Catholic hospitals, they've been told, really all women should be delivering babies and having children, and then gynecologists who refuse to give them contraception. And that's the opposite of having access to your fundamental right to reproductive health care. So we need to really look at how Catholic systems are hurting communities of color and make sure that these rights can actually be exercised.
And I should just add that, like, in that situation where people are in those managed care systems through either Medicaid or through their own, insurance plan, they may not know that they're going to a facility that won't provide those services.
Absolutely, because there's so much consolidation happening, like you don't even necessarily know what rules apply in the facility that you go to. And, people often have to travel long distances to get the care that they need and deserve.
So we should probably make sure we take a minute as we work through this in terms of thinking about a little bit what our colleagues are doing at the national level around racial justice work. You may still have a few friends left back there in New York. So I wonder if you can just talk about the ACLU's recently announced program around systemic equality and around one measure in Congress in particular.
Well, I'm so excited about the systemic equality agenda because it's about so much of the work that I did when I was at the National ACLU. It's about dismantling these barriers to true equality and opportunity for all of us. And those barriers are in the form of institutional and structural racism. So one of the systems that the National ACLU is going to help challenge has to do with student loan debt. We all know what student loans are. We know that more people are relying on student loans today than they were generations ago. But you may not know that Black people on average take out more than $7,000 in student loan debt than the average white borrower. And that within 12 years, they're much more likely to default, setting them back long-term in achieving the economic opportunity that college degrees and higher education is supposed to get you. So we are joining with leaders in Congress, including Senator Warren, Senator Schumer, representatives in Congress, to call for the cancellation of $50,000 of student loan debt. And what that would do is actually unleash economic power in Black communities, and particularly the economic power of Black women who are saddled disproportionately with this kind of crippling student loan debt.
Yeah, that's an amazing thing. I have to tell you, by the way, that when we were talking about reproductive health care, we got a question in and a message in, and if I don't say this, someone who shall go nameless is going to hunt me down and hit me over the head. We passed the Reproductive Health Act 2 years ago. This year, we're going to repeal the Parental Notice Act, right?
We are doing everything we can with our partners to make that happen. And some of you may have seen that just last week, we released an amazing report with partners at Human Rights Watch, that goes through all of the barriers that the Parental Notice of Abortion Act in Illinois places for young people who are seeking abortion care. The reality is that young people who have trusting relationships with their families are able to tell their parents and get that abortion care, get that parental notice. But this law on the books hurts people who don't have those kinds of relationships, and they have to then seek a judicial bypass. And we have been representing over the years hundreds of young people seeking that kind of care, and have helped detail the harms of that law. This law should not be on the books. It's just a barrier to care, and it doesn't make anyone healthier or safer.
Thanks for doing that. You've saved me from abuse. I wonder if you could talk about we're coming close to time, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk for just a minute about the ACLU's work on the national level too, around the issue of studying reparations that's in Congress right now.
I think it's critical that all of us think seriously about reparations. We live in a country that has been indelibly shaped by slavery. It is one of the founding sins of our country, and it has reverberating impacts even today. And I'll just say for a moment about Illinois. I mean, slavery was a part of Illinois' founding too. We had slavery in this state. We had indentured servitude of Black people in the state. And long after slavery was abolished, we have had endemic racial discrimination and intentional discrimination against Black people. Even 56 lynchings took place in Illinois. Lynching was not just a Southern issue. Human beings were lynched in the state of Illinois. And what HR 40 would do is create a national commission to study the impacts of chattel slavery on current people in this country, on the descendants of people who were held in bondage, and to make recommendations. And let's just be clear that this has happened before. In 1988, Ronald Reagan enacted a law that provided reparations, financial compensation, a formal apology to survivors of the Japanese internment, to Japanese people who were imprisoned during World War II, not because they posed a threat, but because of the color of their skin. And here in Chicago too, there has been a reparations ordinance passed with the tremendous leadership of survivors of police torture, of allies at community-based organizations and lawyers. And in 2015, that ordinance resulted in financial compensation to torture survivors, as well as mandatory education about the Chicago police torture in schools, a memorial in public, and a center for torture survivors. So there are models for reparations in our backyard and in this country, and we need a commission to study that because the harm is real.
And there's that element, I think, as the president has reminded us recently about COVID, that we have to recognize and acknowledge this in order to heal.
Exactly. We can't really uproot systemic racism, especially systemic racism against Black and Indigenous people, which is so severe, unless we talk about what happened. And people have these conversations every day in places like Germany, in places like South Africa. And it's a conversation we need to be having here. And I think, frankly, it's a conversation we're starting to have because of the courage of racial justice protesters, people in the movement for Black lives, and people who've been talking about reparations for decades.
So way back at the beginning of this, 27 minutes ago, you mentioned how your life experience had driven you to this work. So I have to ask, are you hopeful? Are you mindful? Where is your level of optimism now in terms of moving forward in these areas?
So I think racial justice is a lifelong and generations long struggle. I don't think we're going to see racial justice tomorrow. I don't think we're going to see it at the end of the year or the end of the decade. But what I am optimistic about is the amazing energy and partnership that we're seeing on the ground. The kind of partnerships that Stacey Abrams talked about when she talked about people going out there and reclaiming our democracy, reclaiming our vote, reclaiming our positions of elected office. We can make change, and we can be a part of that future to create the country that we want to live in and that we want our children and their children to live in.
Well, I think there could not be a better note on which to end this. And I want to say, just for those of you who are watching us, stay tuned. You're going to get lots more information from us about these issues, about the issues you heard during the program. You're going to get ways that you can follow us on social media and take action through our action alerts. All of that will be available. Amazingly enough, and I know you'll be shocked, there's still time to donate. You can text the word ACLU to the number 243-725. That's ACLU to 243-725. Or if you still have a checkbook with a physical check, you can send that to our office, and that address is in the chat. Nusrat, thank you so much for doing this. I'm really grateful we had this opportunity to do this. You know, we behaved ourselves pretty much. They may even let us do it again next year.
I hope so, because I love my job. And if I can just say one last thing to everyone who's listening, just thank you for your partnership. Because when I talked about the fight for racial justice being a lifelong and generations long struggle, it's a struggle that we want to undertake and a journey we want to be with you. And we're really looking at this deeply and thoughtfully, and we really want your partnership in making that happen.
And I just want to say that in closing, thank you all for your time today. I know you have lots of places to be, lots of things that you all want to do. We so appreciate your support and your attention for this long. Thank you for being here. And we will be back. We are not going anywhere because, as been made clear, this fight is far from over. Thank you all very, very much.